Right, Dr. Ian Westmor, board member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists, now joins us for a discussion. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Ian. Thank you for being with us here on SABC News, sir.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Well, I'm listening to that clip and some of the discussions that were taking place at this particular men's forum. And one of the issues that were raised was that, mental health is, one of the contributing factors for the high levels of GBV and femicide cases. To me, it sounds like a bit of a cop-out and an excuse that, I'm mentally ill and this is why, I abuse women. What's your view on all of that?
Well, I think that one of the problems that we know is an issue, and we've spoken about this previously, is that men generally don't come to the fore as easily as women do. And that's so in all parts of the world, particularly regarding mental health issues. And that's because men think that seeking help for mental health issues is seen as a sign of weakness. And that they therefore then walk around with mental health problems such as depression and anxiety, and particularly substance use. They self-medicate for these conditions. Yeah. And we know that all of these play a role in behavior such as is being reported over here. So one could probably give it partial blame, but it's probably not the only issue to blame over here.
Yeah, and I mean, if that is, one of the issues, why then is this particular violence taken out on women? Why is it taken out on women close to them, whether it's their spouses, their girlfriends? What triggers men who perhaps have these particular mental issues to, firstly go and attack women?
Yeah, I think that there are two reasons for that. The one is that men are not, I always say, are not as well equipped in giving expression to their emotions as women do. They don't talk as easily about them. And when they do and they give expression to emotions, it's normally limited to things such as anger, and irritability and frustration, and that could lead to violence. And then if you couple that with things such as substance use, we have a high rate of alcohol use and other substance use in South Africa, then it becomes the perfect storm at the end of the day. And then the violence is then inflicted on whoever is closest to them. So it's not only women, but it's also other vulnerable individuals such as children. So the problem is that the emotional vocabulary is not as good as it should be. And that's why I think that men sort of see that as the only way, really, of giving expression to the frustrations. And it's particularly if it's coupled with something that takes the brakes off, for instance, such as using alcohol.
Yeah. So, all right, let's talk about the solutions then. How do we address this? And, I want to say, because in many communities where one sees high levels of GBV or femicide, we're also talking about, areas perhaps where some of the men might even be unemployed, where, there's also secondary issues. So that would then ultimately mean that, paying for people like you, paying for psychiatrists, psychologists is definitely not top of the agenda, as important as it is. So how do we realistically then, start to address these issues when we can't even get, therapy, counseling for these particular men?
Well, I think that there are resources available in most communities, which don't necessarily mean going to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. You could, for instance, talk to a counselor. There are free resources available, such as the Depression and Anxiety Support Group that has a toll-free line that you can contact for help. Talking to a general practitioner, for instance, could be your first port of call in getting help for something like depression or substance use. and then you can be referred on. But then there are also other people, such as ministers of religion, that are often the first place that people go to and start talking about what's really going on inside of them, and other community leaders. So I think it starts with, first of all, just with a level of awareness of the problem. And we know that this is a big problem in our South African men. And we have one of the highest suicide rates, for instance, in the world amongst South African men. And that shows that and depression is the major contributor to these suicide rates. These should be people that should be close by and that men can go and talk to. But I think it starts, first of all, with awareness and breaking down the stigma associated with mental health and seeking help for mental health conditions in all cultures. We see that across the board in South Africa.
Yeah, you talk about stigmas, and I'll tell you a personal story, something that happened actually quite recently. There was we were watching a movie, and there was an elderly gentleman who cried in this particular movie, and my little son, thought that was quite funny, and that was quite concerning to me, that he thought an older gentleman crying is quite funny. So I suppose we ourselves, as parents, need to, from an earlier age, be able to express to children that it's okay for an elderly gentleman to cry. It's okay to, as someone said in that clip that we played earlier on, to expose, their own fragility, and to challenge some of these stereotypes about, men not crying and so forth. And I suppose this is something that we need to kind of look at from an earlier age, wouldn't we?
Yes, absolutely. I think we need to start breaking down this typical cowboys don't cry thing. I think the problem is that from a very early age, young boys are taught to not be vulnerable. And they then don't know, they get confused then, because how do you give expression to your vulnerability? We all feel vulnerable at certain points in our lives. And if you don't learn, particularly from fathers and other men in the community, how to give expression to those feelings at an early age, very early on, you're going to learn to suppress those and only give expression to what is seen to be acceptable for men. And unfortunately, that ends up being things such as being angry and violent, or perhaps just withdrawing completely and then exploding at a later stage. And that all contributes to this problem. It's never just a single reason. It's normally multifactorial.
Yeah. And I mean, I have no control at what happens in the locker room. I suppose men have their own locker room talks and some of those discussions. And I would assume that some of them can be a little bit toxic and adding to all of this. And I think, where do we begin in terms of addressing these kinds of issues that honestly some of us don't really have control over?
Yeah, that's true. I think, and I can certainly see that in my practice over the last 3 years, that particularly since COVID, we've been under immense pressure as a society, and men have felt that particularly, and they have nowhere really to go and talk about that. So they probably do that in the locker room and then in bars as well when they're having a drink, because then the brakes are off a little bit, and then you perhaps become a little bit more vulnerable. And you start talking about the difficulties that most South Africans are experiencing at this stage of the game. But then you've got to walk out again, because men are stereotypically perhaps thought of as being the stronger gender and the ones that have to provide. And if they can't fulfill that role, then they feel ashamed. And then the stigma cycle just continues.
All right, Dr. Ian Westmor, thanks very much for giving us your time. We certainly appreciate your input very much here on SABC News. Ian Westmor, Dr. Ian Westmor, is a board member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists.